Hello, this is Zach D. Roberts, and I'm here with my co-host, Aaron Cynic, and we are recording the VisuNews podcast. And this week, we will be talking exclusively for the hour about Ocasio-Cortez's controversial dress at the Met Gala. Actually, no, we're going to be talking about Occupy Wall Street 10 years later. Aaron told me I could not go run with that more than like 1 second. Otherwise, people would be like, fuck no, we're gone. And they're not wrong. Although, yeah, I guess that's all that Twitter's talking about. And no one has decided, oh, hey, there's a 10-year anniversary, another anniversary coming up that really probably changed America. I don't know. I wouldn't even go so far as to say as much as September 11th did, because of the implications of not necessarily the day, but because of, Patriot Act and everything else. But yeah, anyway, how you doing, Aaron?
I'm well, thank you. I know it's been a very, very long time since we've actually done this. So, it is good to be back in the virtual booth, on the virtual couch here, in the home of the America's favorite family, The Simpsons.
Yes. Always good to point out the virtual background on a or audio podcast. But
yes, exactly. But no, I'm well. It's been, it's every week is a hell of a week, as we all know. And I mean, I guess you could draw a line in some cases from, if you wanted to occupy to the dress, but really, my only comment is just interesting font choice, and that's it.
Yes.
It looked like Chick-fil-A, right?
Yes, somebody else made that comparison. I was like, oh, God damn it. Now I can't see it. I can't not see it.
You can't unsee that. And that's all I honestly care about any of it. Like, I literally, I'm going to let the rest of the people who have, tens of thousands of followers and really, want to dig into that, just go. Because, hey, you do you,
Yeah, what I always like about these things, and like is in asterisks or with a whatever, like so, an asterisk or something, is that there's a lot of moments now that we've had just in even the last couple of weeks that expose people for themselves and allow people to just open themselves up to, people were like, oh, I respected that person. And now they went on this very weird anti-woman rant about dresses and clothes, and all this stuff. And you're like, oh, okay. So that was what your thing was. Oh, and also, wow, there's also some very weird racial kind of things that I could kind of dig into. But okay. Yeah, sure. But yeah, no. I was very happy to see that. But yeah. Anyway, so this week we're going to be talking about Occupy Wall Street. For those who don't remember, do you want me to do a quick TLDR, or do you want to delve into it?
I think a quick TLDR is an important thing, especially for folks maybe who are somewhat familiar but possibly weren't there or whatnot. But I do think my caveat to that is, while the large one, and so I guess I'll just start with the TLDR first, which is, folks should absolutely remember that OWS was not exclusively in New York, and it was, nationwide and worldwide in a lot of ways, and so it wasn't strictly just people in I love you guys, but we had our own thing here in Chicago, and a lot of other cities did as well, and I think that's just an important caveat.
To be fair, New York was the best one, but from me, famous lover of New York City.
Yes, we're just that's going to be 10 years from now. Instead of who has the better pizza, it'll be who had the better Occupy, and that's what it'll be.
I think Fairbanks probably had the best one, just because fuck me, it was like -60 or something some nights, and those fuckers were off there some nights, but yeah, anyway.
Yeah, give the quick TLDR.
Yep. Occupy Wall Street was spawned out of the economic collapse that we had in 2009. One of many that the millennial generation has had to deal with, basically, because we've got all the big hits of the last 30 years affecting our lives deeply. Whether it be our parents losing their jobs because of the financial crises of the late 80s, or whether it be us, going straight into college, or graduating into the security state of 2001, or it was the financial collapse in 2009, which Obama decided it was better to bail out banks and not actually bail out people who were, losing their homes because they were screwed over by banks, or they lost their jobs because of the economic, I don't think trickle down is the right word, mudslide. Is that good, big enough of a word? The economic mudslide that happened when basically several of the largest banks in America collapsed within a couple weeks, if not short amount of time. And then the kind of 2 years into 3 years into the Obama administration, who had given us the hopes and dreams that this was the guy that was going to change everything, and then 3 years in, we realized that none of that shit was coming, and all we got was a drone program, which I don't even know if we knew at that point how much we knew about the drone program. I'm trying to remember the timeline, but we got more wars, and we got more of the kind of like helping out the rich and hoping down for trickle down economics. And so people took to the streets. It was started by I don't like to say it was started by, because there'd been
Wisconsin.
Uncut, was it? UK.
Oh,
if there's not a fantastic edit change, we had a lost connection there, and so I was just talking about how basically simultaneously, it looks like, because we both had to do a little googling to double check, because our old man minds aren't remembering back in 2011, 2010 as much, but there was US Uncut, UK Uncut, which is a similar, not similar in occupy as in physically occupying a space and things like that, but also just kind of caring about the power of big banks. And there was a big movement to move to local banks and community banks out of like the Bank of Americas and that sort of thing. And also simultaneously, there was also huge protests happening in Wisconsin. Aaron, can you give a quick remembrance of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I only brought it up because that is one where folks physically occupied a space for, literally the Capitol building for quite some time. You really put me on the spot there, man.
No worries. No, so I mean, it was up against Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, and so basically it's a bunch of unions kind of standing against a bunch of the anti-union, anti-worker bills that were just kind of flying through the legislature then, when I think that they had, and I apologize for not being an expert on Wisconsin politics, but I think they had basically, it was, they had all parts of the government, and they were just kind of like pushing things through. They kind of destroyed the public education system pretty effectively there too. And it should have been an early kind of like, oh shit, this thing is possible on a local and federal level. We should probably care about this. And Obama didn't even visit Wisconsin at all, barely even sent a message of going, hey, we probably should give a shit about this. And they did a recall election eventually that failed as well. So Scott Walker got everything he wanted to get. And then Occupy Wall Street kind of came along. I don't like to say started. It was, I think, inspired by a proclamation by Adbusters, a anti-advertising magazine. I don't know, anti-capitalist. I don't know. Very expensive, glossy magazine.
At one point or another, if you're old enough, and this was something else I was going to throw in as a caveat, which is, not just millennials, but us Gen Xers, especially the younger Gen Xers, we experienced
you're
all
just
of
over
those
that
things.
bar.
I was just over the bar.
Yeah. Sorry.
And we experienced the same, the same, exactly all of the same things. But there's a certain age where you get, and I think it might be 40, where everybody did own a copy at one time or another of Adbusters magazine, and maybe some people owned the shoes. If
Yes.
you remember the black spot shoes.
Yeah. They were Converses, basically.
It was
but three times as expensive.
and I will say, Adbusters in 2004 or 5 or whatever. And it could have just been the age I was at the time. I was a lot younger then, but seemed so much more radical or and new and whatnot. The whole like culture jamming kind of movement that was coming out at the time. That's where they came from. And so yes, there was this call that they made to occupy Wall Street, et cetera, but I wouldn't say that they were solely responsible for the movement or for
Well, yeah. I mean, if you read a lot of the journalism that came out of the early days of Occupy, because basically every journalist was kind of trying to figure out how to cover it. I was among them. I was there day one, and being like, what is this? Is this a different? I'm used to protest marching and permitted and all these, and that sort of thing. And even then there'd be like so there'd be black bloc there, but there would also be a permitted march and there'd be a side thing. And so like this was vaguely new to me, not to history, or obviously there in 1999, Seattle happened. And so it was something I think new to a lot of journalists in the way they were covering it. And that because it wasn't like, oh, this is a protest for voting rights. This was a protest against this specific thing. It was kind of an idea, more of an idea-led thing. And the kind of one of the managing editor, I think at the time, of Adbusters, who got a lot of press, was Mika White. And we all have opinions, I'm sure. And so he got a lot of press. He never actually, I don't know how long it took for him to even get to New York. But I think he was in California. I was just rereading a Guardian article about this, so it's not like I actually memorized this. But he was in, I think, California, and didn't even bother to come there for the thing that he ended up building it almost an entire career off of, because now he's like a consultant or something. But it started with very low numbers in New York. Most of what I'm going to say is mainly focused on New York City alone. I don't know what day one was on other places or parts of the country, but in New York,
part of why I'm here.
What's that?
I said that's part of why.
Exactly. Yes, Chicago was one of the. Oakland was one of the other major cities that actually got did stuff. Because there was a lot of places that were, it was like, oh, there's Occupy almost every city across the country, but a lot of places were like, okay, they meet on Tuesdays and wave signs, which is, again, I'm not downing that. I'm just saying there's a big difference between occupying a space for days or months or whatever, and building tents and getting shot at and shit. But yeah, so September 17th, down in Zuccotti Park. It's near the Trade Center space at that point. It wasn't really a full building, but also equidistant. It's literally, you had to cross Zuccotti Park to get from the subway station to Wall Street, which was, I'm not quite sure if that was like a pointed thing to do for the organizers, but it was an interesting thing if you were there around 8 o'clock in the morning and have literally all these guys in Brooks Brothers suits like stepping over people in sleeping bags and shit like that. And also it was one of the biggest things. It was a private park. It was not a public park. And so they weren't able to be like, it was a whole different legal kind of mishmash of things. And that was, as far as I've read, planned specifically to pick a private park over a public park. And which is something that we all kind of discovered over time, that Zuccotti Park was actually owned in part by at least owned by a company that was run in part by the mayor of New York City's girlfriend, which always had a weird edge to it when we're getting beaten by cops and things like that. But yeah, so you want to go to Chicago or a little bit, or?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, because Chicago
Chicago actually started on that same day, on the 17th. Or no, I'm sorry, it wasn't the 17th. It was a couple of days later. It was September 23rd, my mistake. I really thought it was the 17th, but again, this is what happens to your middle-aged brain. So, unless you have, a lot of notes in front of you, which I do, but I have too many. But anyway, it was actually September 23rd. So not too far after New York, and right around the same time, you also had other cities that were like, seeing what was happening and going like, well, yeah, we can do this too. And so day one in Chicago began in front of the Sears Tower. And that was the one. I actually showed up on day two and they had already moved. But day one, another reporter for Chicagoist who I was working for at the time went to the Sears Tower one. And that began about 9 a.m. And folks really just kind of like, marched around there. And then at some point they made the decision to go to our financial district, which is on the corner of LaSalle and Jackson. And that was where they decided like, okay, like we want to do so, we also want to set up an encampment and, this sort of thing, which did not exactly happen that night, or well, it happened that night. And for a couple of nights afterwards, like there was this sort of like in that district for a couple of days, on LaSalle Street, you had like maybe, a dozen or so tents, folks lined up, and supplies, water, food, things like that. And then at some point, and again, it was, there was not like, as you kind of alluded to, it was small at first, right? A couple dozen people, but very quickly what started to happen was you had more and more people showing up going like, because it started to get national news and started to get local news, and people were like, oh, I'm going to show up and check this out. I'm going to show up and check this out. And then very, very quickly, it became a thing where like hundreds of people would show up at points, and during the day, at night, whatever. They actually had shifts because one of the things that happened in Chicago that was different than happened in a lot of other places. Because again, at this same time, this period of like September 17th through like early October, that's when like a lot of other major cities started having their own Occupy things pop up. So you had, as you said, Oakland, you had Boston, you had, quite a few places in major urban environments where people were like, hey, we're going to do this too. And they did have those same battles, with cops, especially Oakland. Folks I know in Oakland, that was bad. What happened here was that after a couple of days, CPD was like, you can't keep tents here. And like on LaSalle Street and this happened actually after the first kind of like melees and stuff started in New York, where they told people to, kind of like, okay, well, you can't keep tents here. You have to keep them, and they kept making these arbitrary rules, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, but what ended up happening was there wasn't a formal like, oh, hey, we're taking this space and we're holding this space and defending this particular space. Because you couldn't. And so people adapted to that here in a way. And we can get into all of that. But, anyway, those first couple of days, not a lot of people, but very, very similar, I think, reasons for showing up. And it's the whole, income inequality thing. It's the whole, the bank bailouts, all of that. And then two, I think, something else that happened alongside at the same time was, Troy Davis was executed right within a couple of days of when Occupy started. And that was something that, that was another, protest movement that began around that, and it began to happen at the same time, and they started to overlap. And that's something that I think, again, it's really hard to go back through the timeline to be like, oh, well, when did this start? When did that start? And these things were happening basically congruently. And there were massive protests all over the country for Troy Davis. And I think there was definite like overlap that happened in there. And that's something that helped, these things grow. But yeah, I mean, and things started popping up pretty much everywhere. I mean, every state had some sort of thing. I mean, like Gary, Indiana, which is only, 25 minutes on a good day from here. Yeah. If traffic's not terrible, they had one, it wasn't big. It was dozens, but at the apex of things here in Chicago, there were thousands, if not tens of thousands, a couple nights here and there, for marches at least.
Yeah. Points in Alaska had Anchorage had an Occupy, and that September in Alaska is considerably different than September even in in New York City or Chicago. And I know that Fairbanks had it, and I think Nome might have had. I don't know what Nome's like the version of it. I really hope for their sake it wasn't camping, because that's those are situations where you die. But
eventually, Honolulu had an Occupy.
Yep.
And you also had them, pop off in, London and, other, it was something that happened like that really kind of like, as it started to build in some places, people were like, hey, we could do this, and we should do this too.
Yeah.
But like I said, here in Chicago, it was one of those things where, basically folks, I think it was a weekend. And I think that's why the cops let them stay on LaSalle for those first couple of days, because nobody was down there, on a Saturday night, at 11 p.m. So, but when it came time, like Monday morning or whatever, when it was like, oh crap, it's rush hour and people are going to work. Now we got to do something about this.
Yeah.
And so that was, and also it's very, very different, like trying to hold, and I think what you brought up too about, Zuccotti being a private park is very, very interesting, because eventually there was something that happened in Chicago where there was this talk about public versus private space, because, you really could, like, there were ways to keep people, to harass people and whatever, and tell people they couldn't do things, on the sidewalk, in front of, these banks or the Federal Reserve or the, CBOT, Board of Trade, that kind of thing. But then at some point, there was a move, a couple weeks in, people actually did try to occupy a public park, Grant Park. And that became an interesting, kind of like First Amendment battle, because yes, it is public space. So you don't have that same thing that you guys had, but it was like, oh, well, according to city ordinance, it closes at this time or whatever. So that was a whole nother thing, but again, I'm probably getting off.
It's I apologize if I misspoke. Day one of Occupy did not happen at Zuccotti. It was actually around the Charging Bull. It was I'm trying to remember what that Bowling Green Park area. But if in Manhattan, you know what the bull is. that big statue. That was the place everything happened. I still remember, like, I was working with I don't know if I was working with, but I was there with another journalist. And we were both talking, and we were, this is after covering the US Uncut, and this is covering years of New York City protests. Every single day, it's like DC, like every single day there's a protest. Almost every day, at least every weekend there's one. And so it's just like, oh, this is another protest, they're gonna do this, and it's like, great. And like they were doing yoga in the park, and there was only, again, only 1,000 people, but like, again, there was proclamations of, incredible numbers showing up, as there often are. I mean, I had the problem, we also with New York City, you had the kind of the original like disinformation shit going on. You had Politicus USA. I always forget whether it's Politics USA or Politicus USA. It's a big liberal, now it's a liberal, I don't know about then, but like it's a big lefty like clickbait site. and outrage kind of site, one of the earlier kind of versions of it. And they were proclaiming that 100,000 people were in the streets of New York City, saying that the media wasn't covering it. And I was like, I wish, believe me, I I was working full-time a different job at that point, and really would have loved to actually cover something that people would, genuinely care about on the day. But even after I sent them an email with a photo of the wide shot of like above my head of the whole crowd, they were like, well, we'll just change it to say there are differing reports. I'm like, I'm saying there's 800 to 1,000. You're saying there's 100,000. Okay. And I'm here. But anyway,
that's one of those like, never-ending struggles, which is that, city officials and police will always undercount numbers by incredible amounts.
Yeah.
Organizers of things tend to overstate them. Yeah. And when you're talking about slight differences, it's not necessarily that big of a deal. If you're like, oh, were there 3,000 or 4,000? At that point, it's nebulous. But when you're talking about the difference between, a couple thousand and 100,000, a
small town and a mid-sized city,
right, it's a thing. I do think though that there was a sense at the time, at least in Chicago, for the first couple of weeks, and even I had this sense at some point, because like I said, we made sure, Chicago's made sure we had somebody there on day one. I started showing up on day two, and then I kind of just started showing up every day. I was also working a different job at the time too. Like that was, writing for Chicago's was not my full-time job. I had a full-time 9-to-5 office job, and I was doing this as well. One of the things that I noticed was that in the first couple of weeks, you didn't have a lot of reporters who came down who spent a lot of time, or if they did, it was a mild curiosity. And there was always this sense of, even weeks into it, I'm not talking on, like late September, I'm talking in October at some point.
Yeah.
Where I would hear people doing, their live spots, or like, you overhear somebody interviewing somebody else that you're interviewing nearby, or you read somebody's report the next day and you have these people are saying like, oh, well, what are their demands?
Yeah.
Everything they want is unclear, and I'm like, actually, there is so much that's clear about this. It's just you spent a day here. Because that's the thing, as you said, when you went all a little newsroom there, man, that was a deep cut of a joke there. I don't know if that, but there's a
now,
protest
Aaron,
every day.
Explain newsroom to people. No kidding.
Oh, for God's sake. I don't
explain
even
Aaron Cynic.
It's on.
I'm sorry, Aaron Sorkin. Shit.
Yeah. It's just on my mind because you know what, Jeff Daniels was on the Late Show last night, and he is an American treasure. And that's that. But no, you had this sort of like, I mean, there were, and I think the way people treated, protests then prior, was that it was just like, oh, there's always something like this happening. And, it gets, 60 second, it gets a 30-second spot on, maybe it gets 250 to 500 words in a daily. And that's kind of it. And then we move on to something else. Yeah. And it's not that kind of like cohesive, like, no, this is actually something that's larger. And I don't think I think some people figured that out early on. And I think it took a while for other people. And it all depends on what the way you look at something. Is this just spot news, or is this, is this actually, do you have to look at this from a different perspective, a movement perspective? And I think that's something that had not really happened as far as covering things. In a long time, at least in a long time. Yeah. And so, I understand, that person, like I can feel that person's frustration because I heard it too. It's like, oh, and you would feel it like it too as a journalist, where you were like, man, I was, you're like, whoa, there's no media here. And I'm like, yo, I've been there all fucking week. Like, I haven't had a day off,
I would, my rule of thumb was don't leave. When I covered it, I wasn't there every single day, and I did literally stay over, but I stayed awake and I just kind of covered, just sat. but I covered quite a few days of the original, because there was an original occupation, and then they got completely cleared out, and then there was a kind of an attempt at a reoccupation, and then there was a series of other events that were occupied but still not. And like I covered it quite a bit. And my rule was don't leave until the wire services leave. And which eventually the wire services, I know that I think it was AP actually started, I think it was a couple weeks in, I'm trying to remember how long, but a couple weeks in, they decided that literally people took shifts, which respect to AP for doing that, because they kept missing things because shit would just randomly happen at 2 o'clock in the morning, which is why I usually didn't leave until like, I'm like, okay, everyone's actually sleeping and I can go back home to go do my 9 a.m. shift in Midtown when I was working at B&H Photo Video. And my bosses were very not pleased because they would occasionally, I'd get something printed like in some publication, then be like, oh, where were you last night? Why weren't you in at morning? Or one day I actually covered something like at 9 a.m. Like they were supposed to not invade, but like go into the kind of space in front of like Wall Street, if you've ever actually been there, but if you haven't, Wall Street is a very enclosed area. Like it looks open, but you have to like, there's a couple roads, only a couple small roads that go in, and every single road has like those big security blocks where like they go up so you can't like run a truck in or something like that. And so it was very difficult to actually physically, and they actually just shut it down. They shut down the entire, one thing that Occupy Wall Street, if you didn't do anything, physically shut down the space around Wall Street and only allowed people who had like press ID, or not actually press ID, I wish, but employee IDs to get in. Maybe not all the time, but on a lot of big days there were. But there's one morning something was supposed to happen at 9 a.m. like when the bell rung and everything like that at Wall Street, and I had to be at work at 10, and it's a 30-minute subway ride from Zuccotti Park, from Wall Street to Midtown on most, especially like during those days. And so like I got in and I'm like, and some things did happen. And so like I'm like literally like had my laptop next to me at work and like trying to file photos while I'm there. And they're like, oh, so why were you late? And I'm like, subways were really bad. Yeah, okay. They're like, okay, Zach, we understand.
That was the thing that I too did, and there were a lot of people, and there were people that I talked to, people I interviewed over those months and things like that, who had similar stories where it was like, like for me personally, it was like I had this 9-to-5 office gig. So I would that was about 2 miles away from LaSalle and Jackson, maybe less. But I wouldn't even take the train. I would walk out of work and then just walk, because I worked on LaSalle Street, just a lot further north, and I would just, if it was nice out, I'd just take a nice 1.5 to 2 mile long walk to the corner and be like, okay, I'm starting my second job for the night. That was my break. Sometimes you get a sandwich on your way, and then it was just like, okay, we're going to start, interviewing people and, reporting on things. But, there were plenty of people who, at least in Chicago, because again, we had that kind of different sort of thing where the battles for like a specific, like, oh, we have tents here. Because, you guys had like a library, and like,
we had, there were structures at a certain point.
Exactly. You had physical structures, whereas like, very early on, that was not allowed to happen. And so people here had to kind of adapt to that and found ways to do it, which was fascinating in one way or another. But it became, a lot of the people I would talk to would be like, oh yeah, you know what? Yeah, I'm a student over at a school nearby, and I'm done with class, so I'm coming over here to support this. Or we had people who worked in the Loop who were like, you know what? Like, yeah, I'm passing through. I like this. I'm here for this, and so, I came down, an hour early before my shift so that I could, be on the line with these people. you know, and I think that that was, you know, that was what was interesting about it, was that it really did kind of cut across, like, I mean, a lot of people who were all kind of stuck in the same shit situation where it was just like, nah, man, like, I get what this is. And, you know, something I want to, I'm going to read a quote real quick from like, I don't know, it was like day 5, maybe, from a person I interviewed, called Justin. You know, this is what they told me at the time, which was, quote, "I want my vote to count more than the amount of money I spend. For my fellow citizens and I want our opinions to matter more than a giant conglomerate." Like, this, and that person, I remember them very well, in that they were very young. They had just moved back to Chicago from being somewhere else and were like, hey, you know, I want to be a part of this. But that same sentiment, you know, existed prior to that. And, you know, here we are 10 years later where that sentiment, people still feel the same way, you know, and that, I think, is one of the sort of like lasting, one of many, you know, lasting kind of impressions, that, you know, things had. And I think again too, you know, the visual of like, you know, you have people trying to set up like, you know, ostensibly tent cities, you know, in places where nothing but rich people usually hang out, to be like, hey, you know, we're here too, is a whole other thing. You know, I had another person I interviewed, called Charlie, for that same story. And this was when people were still sleeping, for the couple days that people were sleeping on LaSalle and Jackson, you know, that told me, when I was lying down last night, wrapped in my 500 layers with a garbage bag over me to keep off the rain, and umbrella over my head, I felt the rain coming down and looked at the bank across the street and all the soft lights, and I was just thinking, we belong here. And a lot of these people that I had talked to at the time, and I don't know if this is the sense that you had too, a lot of them were young, younger than I, and I was young. I mean, I was, you know, only 32 at the time.
One of the big things that, because I mean, again, like I'm trying to find this piece, because unfortunately, weirdly, the place that I was writing for most for was Suicide Girls.
I remember that.
I was a reporter for Suicide Girls at Occupy Wall Street, which got me a lot of fucking cred. Like, I actually, like, I had my own, like, there's a handful of kids that, and like, I would say, like, what was I then? I was 30. And so, like, I say kids because they were, I think, like 17, 18 or whatever. And like, we had, at some point we had a conversation about it or whatever. And they're like, oh, who are you with? I'm like, Suicide Girls. And they're like, what? And it was this great. And they kept remembering me. And I saw them I saw them one night when they they attacked, when Cicely McMillan got arrested. Again, Google her name. Was big within the thing, had a big trial and everything. And they gave me they basically made a hole for me to get to the fence so I could get the photos and video that I got. And then I ran into them at Chicago No NATO, and I had dropped my headphones, and they're like, Suicide Girls. And I was like, what? And I turned around, and they're there, and they're holding up my headphones. It was just like, Jesus. But the problem is that Suicide Girls gutted their entire like blog network years ago. And so they had all this great journalism and great interviews. A friend of mine is Nicole Powers was their like radio show host, and when they did a radio show, and editor of the blog, and she was just like, hey, do you want to do this for me? We don't have any money to do it. And I'm like, yes, of course, I would love the I would love the attention. But I didn't have anywhere else, and I didn't know what to do. And Truth Out, especially back then, didn't do any on the ground reporting whatsoever. So I had tried many times, but they kept saying that they already had somebody writing about it, and they already published it, you know, for the thing that was happening in 2 days. But because, you know, that's how journalism works. But by the way, happy anniversary, Truth Out. You're 20 years old, and this week. But but yeah, no, I was incredibly cynical about it, and I was just like, especially the yoga in the park thing was just like the thing that kind of set me off, because like whatever. But like, and the second day when we got to Zuccotti, and there was a lot more people. I wouldn't say a lot more. There was a different crowd there, and it was clear that they were intending for a longer stay. Like there was planning, they were handing out food, they were doing things like that, and I was just like, I recognize all of these people, like as in I recognize them from the 2004 and 2003 anti-Bush, anti-Iraq or Iraq war protests, like that I'm like, oh no, it's just that those years all over again. I'm like, oh God.
So
And then slowly more and more people showed up, to the point that like, I unfortunately it's not gonna, it won't make a good thing. If you I'll put a link in the show notes. I uploaded almost all years ago. I uploaded almost all of my video that I took at Occupy Wall Street, because obviously I wasn't taking like a lot, because most of what I was covering was at night, and 2011 DSLR technology was not as good as it is now, so I had like everything is grainy as hell and whatever, but I took some interviews. Mostly it's just like clips from scenes or whatever, but I came across this extraordinarily like hippie group of kids, and I was just like, you know what, they're down for interview. Like they were kind of asking me questions. I was like, hey, do you mind if I just talk to them? And like I had like where's the clip? I'm trying to see how long the interview was, but I had a relatively long conversation with these kids. I mean, the clip is 12 minutes, 11 seconds. I know I talked to them longer than that. But like each one of them was just like so hopeful in kind of an intelligent, in kind of a way that was like, look, I know this isn't going to be the thing that tomorrow everything's going to be great, and we're going to have healthcare, we're going to have whatever, everything tomorrow. It was in a really weird, like kind of hippie happiness, but like practical. Like it was just like, this is going to start something. And like that day just changed everything for me. And I wrote about it, and this is what I wrote about it for Suicide Girls, where I was just like, these kids changed my view on Occupy Wall Street. And I was like, after that day, I was just like, fuck yes. Like I genuinely stopped kind of being, I still reported on everything, but like I went from, I'm trying to be a straight reporter, to no, I fully support this and I'm reporting on it, sort of thing. But yeah.
See, I was definitely not as cynical and jaded as you were, which is weird for me to say, pun intended, about it, kind of walking into it, and trying to kind of sort my feelings as to why that was. I'm not sure. I was probably a little more hopeful, than other people. And I think in part it was just because I was like, wow, these, there are folks that are like, this is a thing that is small right now, but it's a thing that is building, right? And, I mean, there was a mix here at some point, probably after about the first week, where you had folks who were very young, who had not a lot of organizing experience, not a lot of, that were just like, hey, I need something, right? Like, I need something. And the thing is, those people, their ages ranged a lot. You had people that were, very early into college, sometimes younger, and you had some people that were in their 20s or mid 20s or even close to their 30s, who were just like, I have just been feeling this sense, there's one person who I know who then started going, because it was like, I just lost my job while this was starting, and I've felt like I've had nowhere to go. And I haven't, I felt so enraged about it. And like, what am I going to do about it? And like, hey, here's this small, but growing movement where it's like, people are in the same situation as me.
Yeah.
And I thought that was like very, like a kind of very hopeful thing. And I think one of the things that happened, here in Chicago, was that at some point, there was all of a sudden like you did see some, like, there were folks that I remember showing up from, you know, the anti-war days and whatnot. And I shouldn't say days because, you know, Occupy in itself also had, you know, was very anti-war. And, you know, we were mired in 2 forever wars at the time. And most folks who were there were not in support of these wars, and, you know, blamed part of, you know, people's financial difficulties, you know, the country's financial difficulties, rightfully so, on, you know, a couple of forever wars, along with all sorts of other things. You know, and I think one thing I did, you know, very early on in covering this was I actually wrote a paragraph into the story that, you know, was just a disclosure paragraph.
Yeah.
And I was, you know, and I had said, you know, I should remind readers, I've written several posts in support of the Occupy movement already. I marched in the streets more than a decade ago in support of similar and related issues and ideas. I've seen political movements rise and disappear into history's dustbin in a heartbeat. Yep. And, you know, this is something that, like, you know, has the potential to grow. Yep. And I think it did. And I think that's a positive thing. But again, I think, you know, at some point you had this sort of mixture of people who were really, you know, young or green into politics or whatever, who were like, oh, here's a group of my peers. And then you had people who were already involved in politics, you know, leftist politics for, you know, a couple years, maybe a decade, in some cases 20 or 30 years, where people were like, this is a thing I should be down with. And I think that's, at least that was my experience in a lot of cases, in who I talked to and what I saw and the people, you know, some of these folks I still, you know, known them for 10 years now.
Yeah.
Just from being there, you know, every day, and or almost every day. Cause yeah, I mean, sure, I took days off too. But you know, we all took days off, but, you know, I mean, you know, I think there were a lot of people who went into, not specifically saying you, but plenty of people, you know, who kind of looked at it as like, oh, well, you know, here's a bunch of, you know, angry young people, angry about how they don't understand the world works, and they're just gonna do whatever. And I think that changed pretty quickly at some point. And that, I think, in some cases had to do with, you know, the repression and, you know, other, you know, all sorts of crazy violence and things like that various locations saw, like New York and Oakland and quite a few other places. Sometimes here in Chicago, but not nearly as rough as, you know, out there. But you know, I think that very, very quickly helped galvanize people and to go like, well, hey, wait, why is the state trying to, you know, mess with this so hard, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, that to me is the biggest, and obviously, again, like I said, like, I think that one of the big differences is that I'd never done, if I'd covered protest, it was there to photograph it. That's kind of it. Do, you know, what are these slideshows usually? I'm trying to remember whether I'd started working for the Village Voice or not yet at that point. I don't think I had. But like literally just kind of show up, take photos, file to my wire, not really talk to a lot of people, other than like the other photographers there, and like occupy, because basically there's so much time. Like you just had to wait because you never knew, like a group over in the corner would go and meet, and then it would spread out through the camp that, oh, we're going to go march. And it'd be like, you don't know, there was no schedule, there's no nothing. So you just had to like do a 10-hour shift, and that was it. Like, and there had been across the street and kind of all around, and like Wall Street, everything shuts down basically after 5 p.m. Like businesses and that sort of thing, except for a pizza shop that was down at the bottom of near the, I guess, more closer to the World Trade Center site, and then there was all of these the vendors when they're not trucks but like the carts and everything like that you see all over New York. Those guys must have made a mint because normally in that area no one would be there, but they did it. And so like you'd go and buy a falafel or something like that and wolf it down and hope that you catch everything. But like I started spending time talking to people, and unfortunately my audio isn't fantastic because I didn't have money for a microphone or anything like that, so it's just kind of on camera mic stuff. But you go through started actually talking to people, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I would say 1 out of, I don't know, not even 1 out of 5, but like 1 out of 8 people you talk to were like, oh, you're here because you listen to Alex Jones, like, and like you're in that world. And like there was a very deep conspiracy kind of not base, but like component at Occupy in New York. And it was not, even though you read articles, and like one thing I've done over the last couple of days is started kind of just literally Googling Occupy Wall Street and hitting news and seeing, because I've been trying to see, like, there's been almost no, one of the main reasons we're doing this podcast is because there's been like fuck all, even op-ed, like, usually there's, 10 years later, this thing happened, write an article about it and that sort of thing. There hasn't been a lot, like, which is kind of surprising to me. But I mean, maybe not surprising. I guess
to be fair, we're recording this a couple days.
Yeah, true. But I mean, like, I don't know. We were having a conversation where like, because we were talking about writing something, and then at least for me, things happen. Yes, we're still going to try to do that. But as we were going through, and like, I'm just like surprised because usually they pump them out like a couple days ahead of time to kind of get get it going. But anyway, like looking back at some of the journalism of like the reporters, Andrew Rose Sorkin of the New York Times, who'd cover things or what they wouldn't cover from nights. And it's not shocking because I still remember it. And it's actually kind of, I think, one of the worlds where I don't know if Occupy was necessarily, it was the final nail in the coffin of me not really having any interest in working for, say, the New York Times. Not only because like one of their great photographers, Bob Stolark, who is literally one of the best photojournalists in New York City, like from September 11th, at least before then to now, current today, he witnessed me get pushed back, trampled, and then beat by cops while I was on the ground. And literally I was standing next to him when he called it into the New York Metro desk, which is, for some reason, the Metro desk was the only place that was actually doing any coverage whatsoever at the New York Times about Occupy Wall Street. And because I guess they were just dealing with it as a New York City quirky thing or something. And they were mostly having economics reporters, like Wall Street reporters, cover it, which is also another problem because you have people, who are relatively knowledgeable about economics and then going and talking to normal citizens and being like, well, these people don't know what they're talking about. They don't know how the economy works. And it's like, I think these people know how the economy works because it fucks them every single day. Like it shows up to their fucking paycheck and fucks them hard. Like they know how it works. But Bob Stolar called it into the Metro desk and saying, hey, a journalist named Zach Roberts was attacked by cops, beaten by them. I witnessed it. I was like, oh wow, I might, there might be a line in, about the night. And it was peaceful protest or peaceful night at Occupy Wall Street. Nothing really happened the next day in the Metro desk. No citation of the fact that like multiple people were arrested, multiple beatings happened that I witnessed and have photographs of. And the fact that, again, a journalist, like whether or not you want to, the journalist was attacked by cops, and and nothing. And it was just like, yeah, no, it solidifies the fact that the New York Times just definitely has a message, and has a bent, even though they obsessively claim that they don't. And it's just like, yeah, no, that's it. But I think that's what Occupy did for, I know it did that for me. I think that's probably what it did for a lot of people. But one of the biggest things it exposed, I think we both knew that because we've been covering protests and that sort of thing. But like, I think especially for a lot of the, younger people that were out there, this was one of their first real exposures of pretty extreme police brutality against people who were just literally marching down the street or just literally laying down in a 24-hour, Zuccotti Park was 24 hours supposed to be open, 24-hour park, or sitting on a bench or something like that. And like that was one thing that like I dealt with. I didn't covered the big war protests or whatever, but it was nothing like the daily brutality that the NYPD committed against peaceful protesters. And the fact that like a lot, I would never say, like, I think that people really overstate the whiteness of Occupy Wall Street, because most of the people I know there were not. But I think it was like also just a lot of kids from out of town, you know, it'd be New Jersey, because there's most of the people I talked to were not from New York City. They were from other small towns and other parts of the country that came in because they saw this thing happening. And they're like, holy fucking shit, you know, because I mean, like unless I've lived in small towns most of my life. And like, as a white kid growing up in small towns, you kind of have to go out of your way to get the bad end of the stick of a cop. And again, that's probably a big oversimplification, but as a white kid, that was my personal experience growing up in multiple small towns. But in New York City, it was just just going to and being at a peaceful protest. I mean, that was literally occupying a space, and just at a moment, you just hear the cops coming in, like jackboots coming in, and then the beatings would commence not because you were attacking them. There wasn't even like, nowadays you have a lot more. I mean, like, I've almost been hit by firecrackers that were flying over my head from people in the back, things like that, like bottles and stuff like that. You just didn't fucking have that in my experience at Occupy. That shit was just not happening the way that even it's happening now. And you were getting the exact same amount of beatings. I mean, there wasn't as much tear gas and pepper spray like they use especially now, but I think that's part of like how it's switched in how police deal with protests. Is that they're like, well, we don't physically beat them anymore. I mean, maybe it's just COVID. Maybe they just don't want to get there.
That depends on the city you're in, because
completely.
As a Chicagoan, let me tell you, they don't exactly really. Even the past 2 years, actually the past 2 years, the most we've seen the use of pepper spray, etc. In a very, very, in my memory, I've got a long memory and I'm old. You know, even during, the Laquan McDonald days, the Occupy days, the anti-war days, the pre-anti-war days.
I remember marching with Phil Oakes and Abby Hoffman.
I mean, but no, I mean,
they're not a boomer, man. But yeah, I know.
They much prefer locally to club you and tackle you and that sort of thing. They're much more hands-on here in that way. But no, I mean, I do think you speak
on
their
doors like, we're hands-on here in Chicago.
No, I mean, literally, they made. No. I mean, for folks who don't know, when we had the shortly after Occupy, there were the NATO protests here, which that's actually how Zach and I met. And the local cops here had shirts printed that said, Chicago NATO protests, we beat your dad's ass in 1968. Wait till you see what we do to you. And these were things that they wore, some of them while on duty. But I think what you're sort of alluding to, and this is where we may get a little off track, but I think is worth at least to mention is that goes back to the Miami model. That goes back to the FTAA protests back, in what was that, 02?
Which one?
01? Free Trade of the Americas in Miami. That was I think that was 02 or 03 maybe. Or it could have been 04. Honestly, like, those days blur together. I mean, some of those years I was still in college. I was a young person.
2000 Free Trade of America's. Oh no, that's a deadline. Anyway, continue. I'm sorry, I was just looking.
No, but that goes back to what is known as the Miami model, which was developed and used, and it was 2003 for the FTA, the Free Trade of the Americas protest in Miami. That was when they were like, these tactics were fully deployed. They were actually developed earlier at the 2000 RNC in Philadelphia. All of this was under the direction of John Timoney, who was the police chief in Philly during the RNC. and in Miami during the FTAA. And all of those tactics were born out of what happened back in the late 90s that you saw like with the World Trade Organization protests in 99 in Seattle. And, you know, there was a piece that we discussed prior to, you know, talking about what we were going to do for this particular show from the Independent about how, you know, 9/11 kneecapped a movement, which, you know, again, it's topical to talk about 9/11 too, but that's a whole other, you know, 9-hour discussion that nobody's going to stick around for. But, you know, there was something that happened back then, you know, and there was something happening similarly, I think, as far as economics goes, as far as anti-capitalism goes, as far as just kind of general leftism goes back in the late 90s, that definitely did sort of get really repressed during the early 2000s. And in part, that was 100% related to the wave of nationalism and all those things post 9/11. Eventually, you had a lot of folks, you know, that kind of coalesced into an anti-war movement that, you know, grew and then shrunk over the years because it takes, you know, I mean, you know, I remember going to, you know, I remember shutting down Lakeshore Drive with 10,000 people in 2003. And then I remember, you know, going to a demonstration against, you know, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2007 or 2008 that maybe 50 people showed up to. You know, and it sort of speaks to that kind of like fatigue that happens to any movement over time, where it's like, if you don't have even small victories or anything, you know, to give folks, you know, they do other things, or they just get disillusioned and they get jaded and whatnot. And I think when, you know, Occupy rolled around, there was just this sort of whole new generation of folks, you millennials, you younger millennials, I say in my old Abraham Simpson voice, you know, that started showing up for things. And, you know, then other folks showed up with
an onion tied to his belt as the
it was the style at the time.
Style at the time.
Okay.
But yes.
One of these days we'll really do it.
Aaron is you're like 2 years older than me.
Yeah, I am only 2 years older than you, but I mean, I feel ancient in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well,
I saw a photo of myself the other day that was from you know, 2012, and I was like, wow, I've aged poorly.
yeah. Well, this past year and a half of
especially the last 2 years of, you know, pandemic, etc. But also, you know, but anyway, you know, so I think what happened though was that there was a sort of like coalesce, like you had folks who were, you know, either knew about, you know, what happened in 99, or people who were there, who were like, wow, this is something, you know, something's happening here, something's forming. Like, you know, I did activism back in the, you know, late 90s, early 2000s, or I was, you know, fighting against the war or whatever. Or you had new people who were like, shit, man, you know, I'm, you know, 20 years old, and, you know, I feel this same existential dread about capitalism, about, you know, inequality, about, you know, racism, about, you know, I literally grew up knowing nothing but forever wars. And so here's these people, everybody's super mad about this, and we're all hanging out in a park, or we're hanging out on a street corner, or we're marching through, you know, we're shutting down, you know, a financial sector, you know, in somewhere, because it has to be done, because things don't have to be like this. I think that was, you know, sort of the you know, one of the overarching things, which was like, nothing has to be this way. And I think one of the trappings that media fell into was, you know, in a lot of cases, you know, especially at the time, you had people who wanted to like report on things as if they were in a box. So it's like, oh, X amount of people showed up to this place to protest this specific thing, and then they went home, and that's it. Where it's like, this was something more nebulous with more nebulous goals. But honestly, like, if you were around, which I know you were, and so I don't mean you personally, I mean, everybody, if you were around, back in the, 2002, 2003, 2001, even during the anti-war days, you would see folks who would show up to, a no war in Iraq protest or stop the war in Afghanistan protest or whatever. You would see folks show up with signs that said, Walmart is a bad neighbor, or, whatever. And you would have people who would say, well, what the fuck does that have to do with this? And it turns out those things are actually related. And I think that's something that Occupy kind of spoke to in that way, where it's like, well, yes, actually, major, big corporate tax cuts that fuel, inequality, that are pushed through by big business owners who have no problem with these forever wars, because a lot of other, defense people are making shitloads of money off of it. Like, all of this is a problem. So maybe we should tackle this from a macro level. And, I think that was something that, like, you saw in some cases where it was just, a matter of like, the whole damn fucking system's fucked up. And it's all intersectional.
Shit's fucked up, and
it's fucked up and bullshit. Actually my favorite chant. I mean, everybody remembers, this is what democracy looks like, and I'm like, I'm bored of that. Not only bored of that, it's just not accurate exactly. But shit's fucked up and bullshit. That's fucking speaks to me.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we saw coming out of this.
I think, like, it's funny thing is, I'm like rereading some of the, been reading some of the things I wrote. And like, one of the things that, not just like the Obama years and the fact that there's so much hope and so much kind of, thank God we finally got somebody who's actually going to do something about it. We can kind of set back. And like, then there was like, the first two Obama years, year and a half or so before Occupy, like just nothing there. I don't remember covering protests at all. I actually had gotten laid off because of the economy, and and also because of oh God, what's his name? The scammer, Bernie Madoff. The nonprofit I was working for, his main funders was with Bernie Madoff. So our funds went from, okay, we're making it by, to nothing in like a weekend. And so I had actually been one of those people that lost their jobs, and then in the middle of the supposedly good years that we were going to have. But one of the things too that I saw, that like, you had groups like Move On that kind of just, and UFJP that just evaporated, and just like, oh wait, is everything still good? I didn't know that just because we got Obama elected, or because the war, or because the moment that John Kerry, back in 2004, the moment that John Kerry won the nomination, UFJP stopped doing protests. Just, there were no, you can go back through, there's no nationwide, maybe there was small like local community stuff, but there was no more anti-war protests that happened from the moment the nomination happened till the election day. And like, then it was a president that, even if John Kerry had won, wasn't gonna pull us out anyway. But and so like, a lot of the larger protest movements that people would usually, over the last, I feel like those years would kind of congeal around, didn't do shit. And and even some of the larger unions and that sort of thing weren't really doing a crazy amount to help people. And mind you, at Occupy, like, I think that a lot of the unions noticed Occupy and were like, oh shit, we got to do something. And
absolutely.
And showed up, and like, there was a lot of union support and solidarity and that sort of thing that showed up there. And as far as I can tell, not necessarily like organized from the top, but like on local levels, not just individuals, but like local, the local chapter 17.
I mean, you would see
iron workers or something. Because they got it, and they got the understanding that, like, that it's not good for anybody right now, and the fact that, like, but it's like the fact
Well,
that
part of
Move
that
On,
too is just a media opportunity.
well,
I mean, let's be real. Like,
I mean,
you get,
but that was one thing that about Occupy. Like, I was just rereading a story that I weirdly I didn't know about, was that John Lewis showed up, and the way that they in the piece that I was reading it, they use it as an example of like the system not working, because the call and repeat system, and kind of, is it okay, is, like the oh my god, what is it called, the people's mic, would sometimes be burdensome. We all, I
no,
think
but
we
you
all
know
have to
what?
admit
I
that.
mean,
But
I'll be real. Well, here, yeah.
but no, but I was
You
saying,
know.
so John Lewis, I guess, showed up to Occupy one time. I managed to miss every single celebrity that showed up there. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to be at Occupy a shit ton, and I saw Michael Moore briefly, and I laughed my ass off when everybody started chanting $60 million man. And and then I'm trying to remember who else I saw. Like Dylan Radican was the only one that I saw that, like, he was a quote unquote celebrity, but he was also, I think that spawned a lot of the conversation that the country was having with his, I guess we could say, early viral rant about, everything. But what was John Lewis showed up, and I guess it took so long to decide if they were going to allow him to speak to the whole crowd that he just said, okay, I gotta go. And however you want to read that, you can read that, and whether it's like against them or against John Lewis not sticking around, or just whatever. But is one thing that I kind of respect about is that he didn't really give too much of a shit about celebrities and politicians, and which is something that I think that the modern protest movements are, I think we've lost a lot of that, and we're starting to move towards the opposite.
I think that varies,
Yes,
and
I
that
mean,
varies from
yeah,
cause to cause, and it
everything
varies from
generalizations.
Well, yeah, of course, but because the same thing happened here, where you would have either local politicians who were vaguely sympathetic, or celebrities, or whoever, or even national folks who happen to be around here at the time, like, show up, and they would want to speak on stack, when everybody got 2 minutes to speak about whatever. And it was like, okay, sometimes people would say, like, yeah, sure, you get in the same line as everybody else, and you get your 2 minutes, and after your 2 minutes you will be cut off. And there was a lot of like, and there's plenty of critical analysis for the way that a lot of those things operated, long debates about how and when Robert's Rules of Order and other rules of order work and whatnot, that I don't ever want to relive in my whole life.
Oh my God, no.
But I think the generalization that kind of came out of it, on a larger level, was like, yeah, we're hip to your game, man. Like, we know that, this is a big deal now.
Yeah.
And you want to be associated with this, and you want to come and, get your picture, you want to get your interview, and then you want to leave. And I'm not saying at all that that's what, the intention of, John Lewis or anybody was. Yeah. But that is definitely a thing that, politicians in general do. And that's something that I've actually seen continue on, at least in Chicago, for larger movements around issues that are sustained issues, be it police brutality, be it all sorts of things, where politicians, local or otherwise, will show up to some protest that has thousands of people at it, and the organizers will be like, actually, none of you are going to speak. This isn't about you. We acknowledge that you're here, and we thank you for being here, and we respect that you're here, but we do not want to be used for a campaign photo op. And I can't speak to other cities. I can't speak to other places. I can only speak to here for these things, because these are things that have only happened, in the past, like 2-3 years, or in some cases the past 5 or 6 or more. But whenever you have a hot button issue where people, where national news parachutes in from out of town, and then what follows are national figures, that kind of thing gets hijacked. And I think, at least here, folks make it very clear, like, hey, no, this isn't about you. And that also happens too with even local things where it's just like, nah, man, we don't want you taking this, your speech at, our press conference to put in your campaign video. Like, that's not what we're here about. So we're just not going to let you like, you guys have a platform. We don't. That's why we're doing this. And I think that's something that, definitely didn't like, that was not started by Occupy in any sense. That sort of sentiment has happened forever. It grew, I think. And I think what happened was people started to understand that once it started getting national attention and things like that, which was that like, oh yeah, like there are, well-known people who want to lend their hands to this. Yeah. And then there are also other people who want to make this about them. And that, that's a thing that movements in general have to be very, very careful about. And I think there are a lot of lessons learned in the past decade regarding that.
It's the difference between a retweet and a quote tweet. Anyway, but
oh God. Oh God.
I know how to make everything terrible. But so I mean, like we we're edging up towards the end of our time, and not that we're implementing time to our podcast.
We had our hour and a half. We can no longer speak.
But yes, Robert's Rule of Order. To bring the people's mic back. But what do you think? What do you think that the kind of lasting effect of Occupy Wall Street is, and do you think that even like past this 10 years and past, like, we've had massive movements that have, I would argue, used knowingly or unknowingly, doesn't really matter, used a lot of Occupy's kind of ideas and kind of what worked, what didn't, like Black Lives Matter and the anti-gun movements and
plenty of pro-fascist movements too.
Oh yeah. Most certainly. And it's something that's actually kind of scary, seeing some of this stuff. Although I would love to see a pro-fascist people's mic. But what do you think that the kind of the legacy of Occupy Wall Street at least should be? Not that what necessarily what it will be, because we're just two schmucks that don't really get to decide this sort of thing, unfortunately. But yeah.
So I think there's a couple, and I honestly think that we've spent a lot of this particular episode reminiscing in ways, and maybe dealing with some of our own trauma, which is a thing too, because we experienced it as well as a lot of other people, and that shit sticks with you. But I think on one hand, and one thing that will probably, if people choose to talk about it, that will be talked about ad nauseum, is how it did change the national conversation in, hey, we talk about income inequality now, we talk about the 99% now, that kind of, the whole idea of the 99% versus the 1% thing, that was a piece of rhetoric that came out, or at least was nationalized by that movement. And that's one thing. I think, we, in the past 10 years, we've definitely talked a lot about income inequality and things. And I think that's a really important piece. And, that's something that will hopefully, live on in the future. I'm reminded of something a person I know said not too long ago, and I would say their name, but I actually don't know whether or not they like to be quoted in random people's podcasts. But I'll just say they're a great person who's been influential to me personally, and plenty of people both in Chicago and across the country.
It's Glenn Green. I'm sorry. Yeah.
God. But
I'm saying, just a famous person who really just doesn't like to be cited ever. That's, doesn't want, anyway. Sorry. I'm sorry about that. I ruined that. Continue. I'm sorry.
You did. But, that said recently, it's easy to find plenty of people to dismiss Occupy, and that those people are mostly uninformed. The fact is that you could trace a lineage from Occupy to all sorts of other movements that include Black Lives Matter and include, various strikes and labor movements and include all of these other things. And that's something I think about a lot, because I think about that a lot on a local level. And I think about the stage of what local politics were in Chicago in the years before and in the years after. And I think and in some cases, these are things that I've actually tracked in stories, whereas that person that I quoted earlier today in this episode, wow, earlier today, it seems like we've been talking forever. But that person called Justin was a person that I interviewed again a couple years later. I don't remember how, it might have been a year, it might have been 2 or 3, I don't even know, that went on to start a cooperative community garden in the neighborhood on the south side where he was originally from, that reclaimed a toxic waste dump and turned it into a place that was a community garden that produced food for everybody in the community, at least. And this went on from, I think they're still there. Although I don't know what it looks like now, but there are a lot of examples of that where there are people who, maybe they got their, quote unquote activism start during, Occupy, who went on to just keep doing the work. And, some of these folks went on to be labor organizers. Some of these folks went on to lead community efforts. I mean, one of the things that happened here in Chicago that was directly happened kind of after Occupy, because it involved a lot of the same people, was we had a whole movement here called the mental health movement. And that there was a ton of overlap there, because what happened was, Rahm Emanuel closed half the city's mental health clinics. And then also at the same time, closed, right around, in the same period of history, closed half the city, not half the cities, but closed 50 public schools. There was a teacher's strike, all of these things. And you had all of these people who, maybe without it, wouldn't have been that interested in these things. But because they, spent a couple days or weeks or months or maybe even a year or more, went on to go hey, you know what? Yeah, okay, so we didn't take down the big banks. That sucks. But you know what? We really could organize together locally and really make some sort of changes and inroads. And I think that happened. And I think the fact that, things involving Troy Davis that happened congruently are part of that. And, because, shortly after that, you had Trayvon Martin, you had Michael Brown, you had Laquan McDonald, you had all of these, and there were people who, some of whom, and there were bridges that were made during those times between groups of activists who might have been not have met each other, but they were, or they did. And I mean, there are people, like I said, who I met then who were, college students who were just hey, I came down here because I didn't know what else to do, but I felt this was something I should do. And now they're labor organizers, or now they're, building community gardens, or now they're, organizing, to fight, police repression, or they're, trying to fight to get, more leftist folks elected to the city council or whatever. So I think that was huge, at least here. I can't, like I said, I can't speak to other cities, but I can say there is a definite correlation between, and for the folks who moved out and moved somewhere else, it was the same thing. It was for a lot of folks then, it made a mark in some way or another that was hey, maybe we didn't, like I said, maybe we didn't shut down the big banks, but you know what? We made a splash, and so we can definitely do something. Yeah. And there's a whole other, I'll stop rambling in a second, but there's a whole other,
media news related piece that kind of goes with that, in that, you know, there is a way people covered protests and even movements before then, because, you know, I mean, I wasn't covering the anti-war movement in 2002. I was part of it.
Yeah.
I started covering it at some point because then I was out of college. And even while I was there, I was like, well, hey, like, man, these fucking, you know, the people who show up to this, they don't give a shit. They come for a quote and they leave, you know? And I think one of the things that happened during Occupy, because of what you said earlier, you know, you have to stay. You don't know when some shit's gonna, you know, shit's not gonna happen at 5 or 10 or 9 or whatever. Like, shit's gonna happen when it happens, so you have to stick around. So, oh, holy shit, you actually have to get to know, you know, you have to understand, this is a, you know, you have to understand your sources. You have to understand what these folks are here for. You can't get this in a soundbite, because there isn't a soundbite, right? And I think that was what people reporting on it struggled with, was just like, we need a soundbite because we have to move on to something else. And it was like, you ain't gonna get one, or you'll get one, it'll be incorrect, and you'll choose to focus on something that's complete and total BS. And I think that, you know, congruently, and this was something that was happening, and why it's related to the anti-war movement and, you know, Seattle in the 90s and things, was that you had similar things happening at the same time, where it was like, you know, your standard reporters show up, they want to quote, then they take pictures of, you know, people getting tear gassed, and they go home.
Yeah.
And I think you have started to see that happening again now, but there was a time where it was just like, and I even think it's carried over to now, where people are like, you know, well, shit, like, wait, let's talk about why this is happening. Let's do something more deeper on it, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that is another, like I said, I'm not going to say that Occupy created that. I will only say that it amplified a thing that was already happening. And I think that's what it was. It was a, it was like there's some sort of video game analogy that I cannot remember. Yeah, it was like a power up, I guess, in some cases.
Like, I don't know. I don't play video games, but I mean, I think that it was the first protest movement that we had that was that was deep in the age of social media, where everyone it was the learning process. I mean, even especially on my end of learning process of figuring out how to use Twitter, how to use YouTube, how to use Facebook, to, you know, and like how to use all these things. And obviously that was in America, again, in America, asterisk,
in
because
America, absolutely,
everything else had already happened in everywhere
multiple
else
times over in other countries.
Yes. Tahrir Square, the fact that I haven't mentioned that yet, I apologize. Like, obviously Occupy Wall Street would not have happened if it wasn't for that, I don't think. Or at least in the forum it wouldn't have happened. But combined with the fact that you know, everybody and their brother had cell phones, the fact that, I mean, on my end it was New York City, there's cell phone networks everywhere. There are, you know, live streamers who built entire careers whose names we won't mention, because at least 2 or 3 of them have turned into fucking crypto fascists. But there's a lot, but the entire idea of live streaming protests, I don't fucking remember that beforehand, and tell me if I'm wrong that
no,
existed beforehand. But like, I don't remember people with cell phones marching along with battery packs and all the jazz. And like, I still remember, you know, okay, I'll mention him, you know, Pim Tool, like back when he wasn't who he is now, yes, marching alongside of him. I'm like, the number of times that I must be in his fucking live streams, but he was there all the fucking time, and there was, you know, many other people that were there as well. And
I just remember being jealous of people who could afford to have, like, you know, fucking batteries and these packs and shit.
Basically, like, shit like that. Yeah.
I mean, I literally had like a notebook and a BlackBerry and a tiny little Fuji point and shoot.
And that was it. That was how I covered that entire movement for a year, like almost a year. It was with those things.
I know. I mean, I had it must have been a D90, and then eventually maybe a D7000, but I think it was maybe a D90, which they just started having video. So all my video is 720p, which is a high quality, was like the top craziness. And but like I had to buy. What's that?
I said super hot at the time.
Oh no, that was like,
that's
I mean,
great.
like occasionally I'd have once in a while. I think I might have sold. I made in a total of all my coverage of Occupy Wall Street, I made in quotes, and I put in quotes, like $1,500. And probably paid to cover it probably $2 or $3 grand because I didn't make I don't think I made a single penny covering Chicago. Like, and anyway, but that's obviously all this I know, but it personally taught me, it was a great crash course in journalism on how to actually do things. I had been an investigative reporter working with Greg Palast before, but like almost none of my job was actually interviewing people. It was like data and stuff like that. And I had never done like proper just reporting. Like the few interviews that I had done were straight up like set up, like, okay, I know this person and we're talking and that sort of thing. Actually, I've covered, other than actually comic book, I've done a lot of comic book conventions. In fact, I was covering New York Comic Con during the day and then going down to Occupy Wall Street, covering that, and then going back. My editor, what do you do? Yeah, it was fine. But I think the big thing that come out of Occupy Wall Street is that unlike every other protest that happened before in America, again, asterisk in America, is that it was a 1 day thing, or maybe it was a 2 day thing. Maybe it was like 1 day and then we have a second day or something like that. And so you go, oh well, that worked, that didn't work, and then you have to restart all over again. And unlike Occupy Wall Street, was every single day something relatively new was happening, and we figured out, I mean, like by the second week they figured out, oh yeah, we're not getting how to get media attention. Like I still remember having a conversation, just being like, the couple days in, and just being like, are you guys really just going to sit around and occupy this space? And they hadn't really done like marches around, like just kind of keep moving. And like, I'm not trying to say that I convinced them to do this, but I was just like, are you really? We're not marching around, we're not doing anything, because like I'm just telling you. There's a video of me saying this, by the way, somewhere, because somebody was recording me when I was like ranting about this to somebody, and I was just like, tell me what I'm supposed to take photos of. I know that you're supposed to, like, I know that like this is journalism and this is not what you're doing, but like if you want to get press and you want to get things, like I'm telling you from this perspective, like the AP, whoever comes down, takes photos. If it's just going to be you guys sitting around in a park with signs, they're not going to keep showing up. And then like a couple of days later, they started doing marches around the block and got interactions with police officers, interaction with other people, and things would actually happen. And it turned into something interesting that journalists, especially like local journalists, again, New York City journalists are hardened, like just like Chicago, of covering fucking protests. And it's like, oh, another one of these fucking things. Okay, cool. And right or wrong, they are. And so they figured out, this worked. Oh, if we change, this is how we use communications, this is how we use walkie-talkies, this is how we do things. And they figured out and they trained, because like also especially in New York, there was waves of people that would come and go. Like obviously it was a leadership movement, but that's horseshit. There was leaders. But like there would be like the organizers, whatever, of the day, of the whatever, and they would figure out how to do things correctly, and they would adapt and change as time went on. They would figure out how to raise money, and then they would figure out how to work with a local community bank. Greg Palast, ex-wife, organized that with the Lower East Side credit union, and because they were raising tens of thousands of dollars a day. And so like they had to figure out how to do that. And all of these people who were, for the most part, none of them were like working for Move On. None of them were working for, big organizations. That's thing. They weren't even, as far as I know, I don't even know any that like were union organizers. They were just people. who cared and showed up and spent the time and were willing to put in the time and the effort to do it. And they learned not through some, panel discussion at a conference, in Missouri or something, whatever. They learned how this worked day in and day out, and learned with experience and bruises and concussions and things like that. They learned the hard way, and then they spread out across the country. And like every once in a while, I'll be in a different town and be like, "They don't recognize you," and we're like, and I'll recognize somebody who was from Occupy. Like it happens all the time in DC. Like all those people are down there, because that's at least right. Like over the last 4 years, that's realistically where like, other than some of the other than the mass murders by police officers, that's where most DC's been the. I feel like New York used to be the main protest area, and now DC is, but that's just maybe me not going to New York City that much anymore. Anyway,
just be you East Coast people.
okay, Great Lakes people. But yeah, I think that's going to be that whether or not we know it or not, that's one of the biggest legacies, is that they created a community, like you were saying, community organizers who didn't learn this through some process, and they're not stuck in this the nonprofit model, or they're not stuck in the union model, and they're not even stuck in they weren't stuck in the like old school 60s protest model of how to do things. They learn day in, day out on what works, what doesn't, especially in New York City. I saw protests change after Occupy Wall Street, how they worked and things. I don't remember covering protests, and maybe Chicago's wrong or something like that, but I don't remember covering protests where the marches would be random, go for miles, people would start sprinting. Like I was in the best shape I've been in like 15-20 years during Occupy, because I put in every night, I put in like 8 miles of walking and running. But that's, I think that, because I mean, like I see that, like I have flashbacks to Occupy Wall Street every time I cover any of the George Floyd protests that I did, of like how they interact with police, how they do it, everything like that. And God only knows whether that's just like a learned thing, or whether there's actually organizers from Occupy that have learned from other people, that have learned from other people, and so on. But one of the problems is that for mainstream media especially, that's not a thing that they quantify, like how it changed what we talk about, how we do the thing that is protest. And I mean, the Washington Post doesn't, probably maybe over George Floyd, but whatever, they don't really have, they'll have photojournalists that follow the protest for ages, but they don't necessarily have like anybody who writes the op-ed stories or anything like that. Washington Post, actually wrong fucking example, because they definitely do, but the Times doesn't, and the Miami Herald or whatever other publications, you don't have anybody who cover these things and like will follow it. They'll do exactly what you said. They'll come down, pull the quotes, and hit their deadline and be done. Or even worse, now they'll just watch a fucking live stream. A lot of journalists will just watch that, and as if that's somehow covering the whole event.
I mean, plenty. I mean, that I mean, for every good thing that we've talked about, good evolution that we've talked about, there's been a million bad ones. And we're not going to go into that at the moment because we're far over time. But I think it definitely changed the way people cover things, because it reminded people that this one protest that happened in a day is not just a singular event that exists in a vacuum. It is something that is part of something that is much larger. And I think one of the things that was a real hard thing, because even in 03, 04, during the anti-war days, it was like, okay, yeah, there were lots of motherfucking protests, and there were plenty. And there was a movement. There were millions of people in the streets against the war and all that. Despite how, folks were, who were against it were, cast aside as, being like literally part of, a small minority. They weren't. There was a movement then. But I think people were coming on, still in that kind of mindset that was like, oh, well,
there's no intersectionality here. This exists in a vacuum. And this is just singularly about, the war in Afghanistan, or it's singularly about the war in Iraq, or maybe it's both, but it has nothing to do with anything else. And like I said, I use that example of, back in 03 on Lakeshore Drive, where folks were holding up, Walmart is a bad neighbor signs. And it's like, well, how is that related? Well, guess what it is? Guess what? Like the shit, mass incarceration and, police brutality and, the entire, all of that's related. And I think that's something that, at least from a news media perspective, people didn't necessarily get in a lot of ways back in those days. And even back in the Seattle days, back in the 90s. And it's because it was a
focused group of people. Like that.
Well, it was very huge, enormous thing, but like I don't remember anyone else talking about Seattle other than I was at SUNY Perch at a college, first off, asterisk, at an art college, double asterisk, and then I was in the only way I really found out about it was because the guy next to me had just gotten back and was looking in the editing room and he was editing footage from it. Right. But yeah.
but that's where that is where and how the very first, and for all their, for all their good things and bad things, that is where the very first indie media, literally when I say indie media, I mean indie media dot, org, right? Which probably no longer exists. That's where that shit got its start.
Yeah.
And that shit got its start because, folks on the ground were like, well, hey, wait, I just got, tear gassed and the shit kicked out of me for no fucking reason. And the only thing that was reported was that, a bunch of lawbreakers were, dispersed by the police. And that was the narrative. And it was like, well, hey, that's actually not what happened. Yeah. And it took, and the same shit happened during the anti-war years. And the same shit happened, like during the beginning of the anti-war movement, or the resurgence of the anti-war, whatever you want to call it. And all happening congruently at the same time. There is this, there are these movements, against, police brutality and against, the carceral system and all of that. Yeah. And everybody's facing the same kinds of things. And I think one of the things that changed during Occupy and then post-Occupy, especially, during, Michael Brown in St. Louis, or in Missouri, sorry, here, in Chicago, during Laquan McDonald, it's like people that you thought would peel off, like you talked about, you would stay until X person left, right? People who had taught, people who would normally have like packed up and gone, actually stuck around. And whether or not they did anything with that footage or whether or not they decided to do any kind of, longer term analysis is another, story for another time. But I think one positive thing that's happened is because of the amount of people who are like, hey, and, thanks to social media, thanks to, places in other countries that did this before, folks here, people were like, well, hey, there's more to this story. And it's not just a daily story or a weekly story. It's, you have to report on a movement differently than you would report on a news story. And it helps that you have a person who, who understands that. And it helps that you have storytellers who like, don't just show up, get their shots and leave, who actually, are invested in documenting this. And that's something that, I don't think used to happen a lot 20 years ago.
I do wonder how much, because I would say
that would be one of the first times that I ever filed from the field. Because there was a Starbucks or something like that down the road and I could connect to internet or something like that. Back when I could carry my laptop, like the few times I actually carried my laptop down there and risked it. But I think that also but that connects to like the live streaming and connects to everything else, is that finally people were able to, that weren't just Reuters, AP, like the big wires who could afford, those things, or also had offices 7 blocks away or something like that. And
right. Or, you know,
but like I could, a random dude who lived in I lived in fucking Queens or wherever the hell I lived back then. I don't even remember. In a shitty apartment, an hour and a half away. I didn't have to actually even go home all the way. I could just find the closest place that had Wi-Fi, jump on it for 30 minutes, and then file up to the wire service that I uploaded everything to and doesn't exist anymore.
Oh no, I absolutely think that's the thing. I mean, I remember once during, you know, in the middle of NATO here in Chicago, I filed a story in the back seat of a car from a BlackBerry. Like I wrote it on a BlackBerry.
Yeah.
While in the back seat of a car going from one place to another. And it was just like, I can't post this in our system, whatever. I am sending here, editor, I am sending you this text. These are the, you know, this is my whole last field. You know, this is 1,000 fucking words. Yeah. Here you go. I'm on my way to the next thing. And that would have not been possible even 5 years prior to that, or heard of 5 years prior to that. It was like, no, you know,
you'd have to call in and have somebody transcribe it, which
right.
I dream of those days. I dream of going back to those days, honestly. Be like, oh,
or you do a live spot, you know, or you do a live spot where it's just like, you know, okay, we have a live reporter there. But I mean, yeah. So I mean, you know, for better or for worse, and that I think is a whole other discussion about how media has changed just in 10 years, let alone 20 or 30. For better or for worse, in a lot of cases it's worse. But in some cases it's better. And I think, you know, things would have turned out very, very differently documenting that particular movement. If we didn't all at least have, like, you know, a phone, or there weren't live streamers on the ground. I mean, that's the first one that I remember, like, that's the first time I remember seeing somebody like literally just with like holding up a phone and narrating, you know, that wasn't somebody who was broadcast. And I think that was huge. And I think that taught some people some good lessons and taught other people some bad lessons. And that's another discussion for a different time. But, you know, ultimately, like, I hope what people take from, you know, that is that, like, there were a lot of things that happened that changed and influenced the next decade and will still continue to do that. I mean, you know, going all the way back to our joke at the beginning of the episode, you know, would we have been joking about, you know, that one person who wore that dress to that fancy people's thing that said tax the rich on it? You know, would that have been a thing someone would have done prior to this? No.
I mean, I had my one note that I didn't check was Bernie Sanders.
Well, and that opens up a whole other kind of.
I mean, that's a whole different thing. But I mean, like, Bernie Sanders was a thing for many, many years. I had heard of him. Like, I knew of him because he was a congressman at that point. I'm trying to remember what it would be. But like, you
gotta delineate years on that one, man.
What's that?
No, yeah, I even used the wrong word. You have to note which years you're talking about at that point.
Yeah, no, but
that might be the joke, and I might have, you know.
Oh no! I just didn't remember.
I forget when he became a senator versus a congressman. There wasn't a joke. It was just literally a like, oh, was it 2004? Anyway, doesn't matter. It's not really necessarily relevant, other than the fact that I don't think that without the national conversation of the 99% and everything like that, and that pervading, that becoming just every person in America knows, especially at that time. If I said, well, the 99%, fuck them, they knew exactly at least an idea of what that meant. Obviously, They didn't necessarily know, you know, they'd be like, well, it's actually 93% because or something. But yeah, anyway, what a
semantics, debate me. Why won't you debate me? Debate me.
Yeah. I mean, that's always one of those questions where, like, the good and bad things that came out of Occupy, because I mean,
yep, that's episode 3 or 4 in this series. Yeah, like we don't even.
This is part 70. This is why we don't do TikTok, because it would be on 74. This is part 74 of the discussion of Occupy Wall Street and whether it's was a good thing or a bad thing. As I have my Molly Crabapple art behind me, and in front of me actually. But anyway, yeah. So Any last thoughts?
I mean,
we
just
already had our last thoughts, but
we already did that. But again, I think actually, I'll give you this. One of the things that I learned about watching movements and covering movements back then, and having been a part of movements for many years, for a decade prior, was that, folks need small victories. Folks need big ideas and ideology, and they want to keep that going. But every now and again, folks need just, something tiny they can just be like, hey, we got a W on this, and I think, everybody's analysis is like, well, Occupy didn't accomplish anything because they didn't achieve all these lofty goals. And I'm like, yeah, well, you know how many more people are doing amazing work now just because they showed up there one day? So it's like, you take what you learn from one experience, and you take the good with the bad, and you use that to move on and move forward, and you just keep going.
I think what Occupy did, and I at least for a lot of people, I think it certainly did it for me, is changing
what the metrics are of success are, and looking at it. I mean, you said it ages ago, macro versus micro, but like it is so important when you're talking about protest, whether like what's the purpose of the protest. First off, like having a protest directly, having Congress people at a protest organized by Move On in front of the Capitol, that is intended hopefully to do one thing, and it is influence and get like a certain very particular type of media and to hit it, and that's it. And that's what it is. It's a one-off thing versus a Occupy Wall Street or a Black Lives Matter movement, because it's like, again, like what did Black Lives Matter really, really succeed at? And it's like, well, if you're talking about like numbers of police arrested, what's that?
I was just gonna say a fucking whole hell of a lot.
Oh, no, but I mean, here's the thing. It's like, if you're gonna
metrics are like, are Black people stopping? Are Black people done? No longer shot by police? No. Are police by the numbers being arrested and actually incarcerated? No. But if that's not specifically in the thing, if you're talking about actually, there's laws being passed, there's change at least in Minneapolis and many other cities being being done. The conversation is being had, and how many other leaders have come out of that, and like all of the other things that you talk about. And it's like, yeah, no, did all the anti-war move, I mean, like, maybe that's a bad example. I mean, like, the anti-war movements ever end a war? Has anti-war protest ever, an individual protest, ever ended a war? No, they haven't. Have they even put a dent in ending the militarized industrial complex that we live under? No. But should we just stop doing them? No. Yeah. Anyway, I guess that's my final thoughts too.
You know what? I'll tack on one more thing, which is that, there's a certain school of thought that exists in places that says, oh, well, if we want to make our movement or our cause or our struggle, quote unquote, legitimate, we have to find a politician to champion this. And if it's one thing that a lot of things in the past 10 years have shown people, be it Occupy, be it Black Lives Matter, be it, here in Chicago, there are several elections that I could name, is that you actually don't need to go to them. They're going to come to you at some point. And so you don't have to beg them for shit. You just have to keep fighting.
Yep. That's a fantastic place to end. Aaron, where can people find your work and find you?
You could find me on Twitter at Aaron Cynic. You can find me on Instagram at Aaron Cynic. And you can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/Aaron Cynic.
I like that it's Patreon. Because it implies that it's Pat anyway, but
yeah, I don't know that shit, dude. Like,
but no, I enjoy that because is it Patreon? Is it Patreon? Is it whatever? Anyway, it's
idea.
not a word. But
and where can people find you?
They can find me at ZD Roberts on Twitter. You can find me. Sorry, I was trying to remember a line from a Bob Dylan song that would have worked out well, but it's not as funny when it's not in my head.